Okay, so if you remember in the last video, I started talking about discrimination, and I left off where there was going to be a video that I didn't want to play here to make the lectures too long. But it, remember, had a split screen with a white man and a black man going through the same things in their days. Driving, buying a house, buying a car, all these different things, and showing the disparities that they encountered just by virtue of being white and being black. Um, so these are all examples of subtle discrimination. There's no policy that's necessarily set up to make black men be much more likely to be pulled over than white men, or make them more likely to have a higher car payment, but they're just ways that subtle discrimination at an individual and institutional level can lead to disparities. So one of the particular examples in there had to do with a difference in hiring too, right? Where they had that study where they sent out the different resumes, one that had a stereotypically black name, one that had a stereotypically white name, and just saw how many callbacks they got. And there's lots of real studies that have to do with this. It's a very well replicated effect that shows that white names and male names compared to female names, white names compared to Hispanic names, all these times white men are going to get callbacks at a much higher rate than anybody else, basically. In fact, in the study that they showed in the video, black names were only about half as likely to get a callback as a white name. So a couple of researchers, Jack Dividio and Sam Gertner, were trying to look into why. Why is this disparity there? What's the process by which this disparity is coming about? And instead of sending out resumes in these real studies where they, or these real circumstances where they send them to employers, they wanted to be able to ask follow-up questions. So they did a series of studies with undergraduates where they were showing them resumes of equally qualified black and white job candidates. So people would get randomly assigned to get one of these resumes and rate how hireable they thought the person was. So they would get resumes that were either weakly qualified, strongly qualified, or ambiguously qualified. So a clear signal they should not get the job or not very hireable, clear signal they should get the job and were hireable, or some kind of mixed information like, maybe they had a couple relevant jobs, but they got fired from one and their, GPA was somewhere in the middle or something. What they really wanted to see here was how did participants rate their hireability on a scale from 0 to 100. And what they found was when there are really clear signals, when things are unambiguous, like when the candidates are strong or when the candidates are weak, there's not really a difference between perceptions of black and white candidates. They're both perceived as very hireable when the credentials are strong, and they're both perceived as not hireable when the credentials are weak. Dividio and Gertner's big contribution to this was with the ambiguously qualified people. What they find here is that white candidates have an enormous advantage over black candidates. And it seems to be because of those ambiguous signals. When signals are really clear, racism or discrimination in other domains doesn't really have the ability to creep in, it seems. People use the strong signals that they have to make appropriate decisions. But when the signals are mixed, when it's not really clear how hireable somebody is, or not really clear what you should do or what direction you should go, that's where you see bias creep in. When people have ambiguous situations and they don't have concrete information to hang their choices on, that's when racial bias and in-group preferences tend to come in and give preference to, in this case, white over black candidates. So Dividio and Gertner called this general framework that they kind of developed around these observations aversive racism. That people have ambivalent attitudes towards groups sometimes. In the case of white Americans in the United States, they have positive and negative attitudes about black people, and that these things are, the negative attitudes that they have are expressed when situations are ambiguous. Aversive racism, the name comes from the idea that in the United States we're generally brought up to value egalitarianism and know that everybody is equal and we shouldn't judge people based on the color of their skin and all these things. But we still have these cultural stereotypes. We still know about racial differences, whether they're accurate or not. We're aware of these types of cultural understandings and the negative associations with different minority groups. And so because we don't want to be racist, we try not to be when we know what to do. But when we don't know what to do, those racist ideas can come in and sort of guide our decisions. So when there aren't clear social norms, when there are clear social norms, and if you did something discriminatory, it would be obvious, people don't do it. But when situations are ambiguous, people tend to think about group differences more, or maybe even unconsciously rely on group differences and allow them to guide their decision making because they don't know what else to do. So that negative affect toward different minority group members might seep in to decisions when it's ambiguous and not when there are clear norms or clear signals about what should be done. Another sort of subtle type of prejudice and discrimination is something called symbolic racism that some political scientists, Don Kinder and David Sears, came up with in the late 60s and early 70s. Symbolic racism is kind of an answer to one of the things we talked about in group processes, the idea of realistic group conflict theory. So remember, realistic group conflict theory was this idea that people, intergroup hostility is completely based on zero-sum games and discrepancies in how resources are getting allocated. Like, we want water, we can't both have water, so I'm going to discriminate against your group and compete against you because we both want the same thing. Symbolic racism instead says that some intergroup conflicts, and racism in this case, have to do with just more abstract symbolic ideas about intergroup differences, not about zero-sum sorts of ideas. So symbolic racism was developed as what they called a blend of anti-black affect and traditional American moral values, things like the Protestant work ethic and individualism and working hard to pull yourself up and all these sorts of things like that. I have noted here, usually symbolic racism is measured with 8 different items, but sometimes we measure it with just 4 and call it racial resentment. They basically are the same thing, but just kind of psychologists tend to say symbolic racism and political scientists tend to say racial resentment. But the types of items here are, things like Italian, Irish, Jewish, and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Or a reverse-coded item. Over the past few years, blacks have gotten less than they deserve. So if you agree with this item and disagree with this item, then you're going to have a higher racial resentment or symbolic racism score. This was developed in part as a way to measure racism in a way that wasn't so obvious and that people would be willing to endorse. Like, when you ask people about stereotypes about different groups, how lazy are black people, how intelligent are white people, how hardworking are black people, how unintelligent are white people. Like, when you ask people these things, it's kind of obvious what you're doing, and sometimes people don't want to admit that they have negative attitudes about minority groups. But when you ask people things that are sort of deniable in these weird ways, like, hey, yeah, people should work hard to get ahead, and you mix up together, anti-black affect and these types of American values, people are more willing to endorse these ideas, and the more of them you endorse, the more you tend to have this sort of resentment towards, in this case, black people. But there are other types of measures that do sort of the same thing with different minority groups. So the way they sort of tested this in the first place was with voting. They were looking at if people's prejudice would creep into their choices about candidates. And Sears at the time was at UCLA. They were in Los Angeles. And in LA at the time, in 1969 and 73, there was a black candidate for mayor that ran in both those elections, lost in 69, won in 63, Thomas Bradley. And they were trying to look at whether things like, economic hardship and scarcity of jobs, things that had to do with, concerns that would have to do with realistic conflict theory, would predict vote choice. Or is it more things like these symbolic ideas about, who's working hard enough and things like that? And they found that the strongest predictor of vote choice for Bradley, even above and beyond ideology, was this measure of symbolic racism that they used. And this isn't just something that happened a million years ago. It's something that still predicts vote choice very strongly in the last 3 presidential elections. Unsurprisingly, racial resentment and symbolic racism, they tend to matter in elections because they tend to be somewhat related to ideology. But in 2008 and 2012, when we had our first black president elected and reelected, racial resentment was one of the strongest predictors there. And in 2016, when there was also a lot of racial rhetoric that was infused into the election there, it was an enormous predictor for Trump as well. The more racially resentful people were, the less likely they were to vote for Obama in 2008 and 2012, and more likely to vote for Trump in 2016. Maybe more interesting than that, and again, I use interesting in the sense that, like, this is terrible, look at this, that racial attitudes, okay, you can see sort of how if people have negative attitudes about blacks, then they're not going to vote for a black guy, and they might vote for somebody who expresses racial prejudice, right? But the kind of scary thing about racial attitudes is that they spill over into other things. Racial resentment, after Obama became president and was tied to all these other political objects, people's racial attitudes spilled over from their evaluations of Obama to other things. So things like his tax plan, his response to the financial crisis in 2008 with bailouts, his Affordable Care Act, were all very strongly associated with people's racial attitudes, such that people that were more racist liked those things less and supported them less than people that were more racially liberal or less racist. In fact, the affordable, geez, I even have the wrong name in here. It should be Affordable Care Act, obviously. But the most effective thing that Republicans did to get people to dislike the ACA and not support Obama's healthcare plan was to brand it Obamacare, because every time people talked about this act, or this plan, in every media source, people were calling it Obamacare. So every single time it was mentioned, people were associating it with this black president. So people's racial attitudes were associated with the healthcare plan. And to maybe lighten it slightly, I don't know, I don't want to say funny, because none of this is funny, but maybe the most interesting thing that this spills over into is that it spills over even into totally meaningless things. So while the Obamas were living in the White House, they bought a family dog, and it happened to be a Portuguese water dog that they named Bo. And just by complete coincidence, Ted Kennedy's family also happened to have a Portuguese water dog. So Michael Tesler, a person who's done a lot of this research on the spillover of racialization, he conducted this experiment where he showed people the same exact picture of a Portuguese water dog, and he would tell people randomly it was somebody else's dog. So some people heard it was the Obama's dog Bo, some people heard it was Ted Kennedy's dog, and then he would ask people, hey, how much do you like that dog? And in the Kennedy condition, when it was just some random, white politician's dog and racial attitude should have nothing to do with it, they didn't. Racial resentment didn't predict people's favorability of that dog. But when people thought the dog was Obama's dog, an enormous predictor of people's favorability of the dog was racial resentment. If you were really racist, you didn't like that dog very much. But if you weren't racist, if you endorsed less of the racial resentment items, then you did like the dog more. It's dangerous to say that people that don't endorse those items are not racist. That's not true. They just are, less racially resentful in that specific meaning. Okay, so I want to talk about a few more types of discrimination before we, one more type of discrimination before we shift to some other stuff. We've talked about blatant and subtle discrimination. Covert discrimination is another important one to talk about. Blatant, it's out in the open, it's obvious. Subtle, it is more hidden, maybe even sometimes unconscious or built into the kind of framework of how our society works. Covert discrimination is a little bit different in that it's more maliciously hidden, like people trying to purposefully malign or hold back people of particular identities in some sort of secretive way. So it's very hard to document and sort of blame people or hold them accountable for it. So some examples that we might usually think about with this come from the workplace, where you are doing something like engaging in tokenism, where you're maybe hiring minority members just to say like, hey, I'm not racist, or people that say like, no, I have a black friend, or no, I talk to women, these sorts of things where you're just propping up people with your bona fides of saying that you have some association with people of a minority group. Back to more specific workplace examples though. Excuse me. Containment is a practice by which people, have minority members in their organization, but they only let them have certain positions, perhaps where they're not going to advance, like positions that are kind of dead-end jobs, basically, or sabotage is kind of like an extreme example of containment in a sense, where maybe you assign minority group members to positions that they're going to fail, like giving them a harder task or giving them a sales territory that no one sells in or something like that. So engaging in these things, bringing minority group members on board, keeping them segmented into dead-end places and giving them assignments that are difficult, these are ways that people can kind of refute claims of racism while very intentionally keeping minority group members within their organization from doing better. So again, these don't really fit into the blatant and subtle types of discrimination because they're very purposeful, but they are hidden in a way that is very malicious. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there and start talking about implicit bias on the next lecture, so I will return in a moment.